Yuji's long-awaited curse technique reveal might have finally come in chapter 238 of JJK. This was a very small detail that was hidden in all the madness of the rest of the chapter. It's a reveal that comes after Sukuna proves exactly why he's the strongest sorcerer in history, now that he's in his new reincarnated four-armed form. It's explained that because of his extra set of arms, he's able to weave hand signs that allow him to use ultra-powerful attacks and enhance his existing ones, like we saw Gojo do to create the 200% hollow purple at the very beginning of their fight. Along with this, the extra mouths that he has on his body allows him to perform chants constantly as he fights, to strengthen his attacks even further. All this proved to be way too much for Kashimo, who seemed completely overwhelmed even while using his broken curse technique. My shares of Kashimo stock are at an all-time low right now. Don't want to talk about it, but I have to. In a surprising event, we even saw Sukuna use the same dismantle attack that he used to finish off Gojo, the slash that cuts the world. Well, after Kashimo was given the obvious death flag treatment with a little dream sequence that he had with Sukuna, we're shocked to see that both Yuji and Higuruma have burst onto the scene as Hikari's domain expansion shatters. Now, if you look closely at this panel of Yuji as he's jumping in to fight Sukuna, there's a few glaring details that allude to a pretty significant new power awakening of some kind. First, the most obvious thing to point out is that Yuji seems to have these veiny claw hands, very similar to how Sukuna's hands would appear at times when he took over Yuji's body. Along with that, it looks like his wrists are bandaged up, and his forearms seem to be particularly bony at the elbows, and it seems like he has some kind of exposed musculature or something on one side of his forearm. It might even look like he has it on his face too, but that could be a shadow, we don't know yet. The last thing we can point out here that seems important is that it seems that Yuji is either removing the bandages on his wrist with his mouth or just straight up biting his own wrist. Seems like a pretty insignificant detail, but just trust me, by the end of the video you'll see exactly why this is all actually very important. It all has a payoff, just believe me. It's pretty obvious that Gege was trying to tease some new abilities that Yuji will use against Sukuna in the next chapter, and considering he's charging in headlong and looking pretty determined to do so, it's likely he's gotten a pretty serious power buff from them. So here comes the big question you've probably been wondering this whole time. Well, what the is Yuji's new power then? Well, although it seems we only have this single panel to go off of from this chapter, we've actually gotten quite a few seeds of information throughout the manga that'll give us a pretty damn good idea on how to answer that very question. Also, it's actually more likely that Yuji has multiple new abilities, not just one. First of all, we have to remember that the last time we saw Yuji fight, he had already shown signs of having an awakening of some sort, but at the time it was kind of unclear exactly what was happening. When Sukuna first took over Megumi's body, Yuji leapt angrily from a concrete roof with so much force that it completely shattered it. Sukuna's face while seeing this said it all. It came out of freaking nowhere. He even thinks to himself as Yuji's going berserk on him, where the hell is this strength coming from? That's when he says something really interesting. He says, "Oh, I get it. He's from that time," and ends the thought by mentioning that Kenjaku sure does some gross things. Well, we know from a weird Yuji flashback that Kenjaku is technically his mom, or his dad, however you want to look at it, doesn't really matter. But considering we now have some pretty good images of what he and Era Sukuna looked like, his face kind of resembles an older Yuji, aside from like the, tree face thing he has going on one side. This would lead someone to think that Yuji is likely some kind of clone of Sukuna from his time as a young human in the Heian era, and that's why Sukuna says that he's from back then. While Yuji is likely a clone created by Kenjaku, it's not a clone of Sukuna. Well, he kind of is, but not exactly. We'll get back to that though. Just put a pin in that for now. In chapter 220, it's explained that considering the amount of time that Yuji spent as Sukuna's vessel, he's now something of a cursed object, soaked in Sukuna's cursed energy. For Yuji, this indicates a pretty sizable cursed energy buff, if nothing else. Right after this, Yuji points out that he'll eat anything to beat Sukuna. A little later, Choso hands over a book of Yuki Tsukumo's research on the soul to Yuji. This book is going to come into play in a minute, so put a pin in that one too. We got 2 pins so far, don't worry about them for now. The main thing to focus on right now is what's said after this. Yuji apologizes for Choso's brothers, and Choso simply responds by saying, "It's okay, they'll live on through you." Considering what Yuji just said earlier about eating anything to beat Sukuna, there's a good chance that this means that Choso gave Yuji the remaining Cursed Womb Death paintings that Choso recovered from the cursed warehouse at Jujutsu High. In an interview that Gege did a while back, he once mentioned that consuming the death paintings would allow Yuji to absorb them as pure cursed energy, giving him another massive cursed energy buff on top of the one he got from being Sukuna's vessel. Well, having a shit ton of cursed energy is great and all, but it's not worth much if Yuji doesn't have a curse technique to utilize it all. It's like having a 24 pack of Duracell batteries with nothing to put them in. Might as well not have them, right? Well, I think that's finally changed. From the beginning of the manga, it was alluded that one day, Yuji would likely inherit Sukuna's curse technique or even develop his own after being his host for so long. Well, assuming that's finally coming to fruition here, the next mystery that needs to be answered is what exactly is Sukuna's curse technique then? Well, to answer that, we have to learn a bit of ancient Japanese history, as it's been shown in several instances that Buddhist principles and Japanese lore were heavy influences on Gege when he created Jujutsu Kaisen. For starters, Ryomen Sukuna was an actual real-life deity of sorts that was said to have come to be around the year 65, according to the Nihon Shoki, the second oldest book of classical Japanese history. In these writings, Sukuna was known to have two faces and two sets of arms and legs, heavily resembling the design of Sukuna in the manga. In the Nihon Shoki, Sukuna is described as an evil, bloodthirsty being that killed countless people and brought destruction everywhere he went. Sounds pretty spot on for our manga counterpart here. However, and this is where we get into some really interesting stuff, people in the Hida and Mino provinces of Japan actually treated Ryomen Sukuna as a hero and worshipped him. And the location of this is actually very interesting considering that Kenjaku located Sukuna's mummified corpse in chapter 220 in the holy mountain of Hida. This tells us that there are quite literally two faces of Sukuna in Japanese history, an evil one and a good one. This is why many believe that the legend of Sukuna in history is actually a representation of another Japanese tale involving two brothers named Uosu and Takaru, where the latter is said to represent the Sukuna of the manga because of his similar violent temperament. In the tale, Takaru ends up killing his brother Uosu. The reason why in the story isn't really important to us here. All you need to know is that Takaru was a bad egg and he killed his brother. The reason I went through the trouble of explaining all of this is that a long-standing theory about Sukuna's real origins in the manga stems from Gege's direct use of these exact stories as inspiration for the King of Curses. The theory states that long ago, when Sukuna was actually a human, he also had a twin brother that was kind-hearted.
Are you twins in real life?
No.
Much like Yuji. At some point though, Sukuna consumed or fused with his own brother somehow in order to become stronger. His reason for doing so has actually already been laid out to us with the case of Maki and Mai. With them, we were introduced to the idea that twins in the Jujutsu world were looked down upon, specifically because of the fact that curse techniques treat twins as one in the same, meaning that while both of them are alive, the full potential of one twin can never be realized unless the other died. That's why when Mai dies, Maki's heavenly pact was fully realized, and she gained a massive buff in strength, putting her on the level of the Chad himself, Toji Fushiguro. This means that if the theory's true, the reason Sukuna got rid of his twin brother was to reach his full potential as a sorcerer, something that perfectly aligns with his view on strength and what it means to reach your full potential. In his fight with Jogo, Sukuna says that he found it pathetic for humans and curses alike to flock together because it hinders their growth and potential. This is why he told Jogo that he should have burned everything around him to the ground to truly ascend to the level of someone like Gojo. This is likely the very thought that Sukuna had in mind in the Heian era when he killed and fused with his brother. We know next to nothing about Sukuna's past as a human, but we actually got an important nugget of information about it in chapter 227. In this chapter, Kashimo asked Sukuna if he worked hard to become the strongest sorcerer or was simply born that way. In the Shonen Jump translation, he simply says, "Who knows? I was probably a wicked kid though." In other translations, however, he says something more along the lines of, "Beats me, I was born as a cursed and unwanted child," meaning that if we assume the theory that he consumed or fused with his own brother long ago to be true, this means that Sukuna was likely seen in the same negative way that Maki was, a worthless twin that was only hindering the potential of the other and something something that needed to be disposed of. It's likely that Sukuna was aware of the limitations he and his brother faced as twins, splitting cursed energy and a cursed technique possibly, and took the initiative to strengthen himself by force. This is when Sukuna's true curse technique comes into play. He was likely able to consume and utilize his brother's cursed energy and cursed technique because Sukuna's own technique is being able to consume a sorcerer's cursed energy and add it to his own reserves of cursed energy, along with being able to utilize their cursed techniques in a way. He can pretty much take a nibble out of a sorcerer, absorb the cursed energy that he bit off, and possibly even understand their cursed technique from it enough to use it himself, or a pseudo version of it. I know this sounds a little bit confusing and convoluted, so let me explain a little deeper. Back when Mahito was still kicking around in the manga, he introduced the concept that the soul and the body are one and the same, and had the ability to directly manipulate it, and therefore was able to shapeshift and transfigure bodies by doing so. Sukuna likely learned this secret of the soul himself, and realized that by consuming others with cursed energy, he would be able to add that energy to his own soul and body and grow stronger. If he could do this, it would also make sense exactly why he could take someone's curse technique, or at least gaining enough understanding of it to make a pseudo version of it. Considering the mind and the body is the same, and people's inherited curse techniques are engraved in their bodies, specifically in the prefrontal cortex of the brain, consuming the soul means you consume the body, also meaning you consume the curse technique. However, it's possible that Sukuna didn't have the strength to do so, considering he was splitting cursed energy with his brother, so he consumed or merged with his brother by combining their souls, which allowed him to use his cannibal curse technique to its fullest extent. If you're a Hunter x Hunter fan, think of this like how King Meruem had the ability of aura synthesis, where he could inherit the aura and later the nen ability of any nen user he consumes. Gege is heavily influenced by Yoshihiro Togashi, the creator of Hunter x Hunter, so it wouldn't be a stretch to assume that he used Meruem's ability as a blueprint for Sukuna's. Along with being a jujitsu genius, Sukuna could use this continuous supply of cursed energy from consuming sorcerers to reshape his own soul and therefore change the properties of his own cursed energy, doing so in order to mimic the other curse techniques of the sorcerers he consumes. This actually explains how Sukuna seems to be able to use multiple abilities, like the flame technique he used against Jogo. After all, we saw that having cursed energy with different properties is possible with how Hikari has jagged cursed energy and Kashimo's has an electrical charge. Sukuna actually already proved that he could use pseudo curse techniques by using Max Elephant's water attacks like a piercing blood during his fight with Gojo. Well, at this point, this is where I gotta go back to something that I said earlier, when I mentioned that Yuji was likely a clone, but not of Sukuna's, so you can safely remove that pin from the board. It's very possible that Kenjaku managed to somehow create a clone of Sukuna's twin brother, because what better vessel for the King of Curses than his own former flesh and blood, right? That's why Sukuna called Yuji's existence as a gross thing made by Kenny. Not that Kenny, this Kenny. This is all to say that Yuji might have unlocked the ability to consume organisms that contain cursed energy and absorb it into his own reserves like Sukuna can. And this would perfectly explain why Gege mentioned this would happen if Yuji consumed the death paintings like I pointed out earlier. That might even be why Yuji has this odd appearance at the end of chapter 228. This might be the activation of the curse techniques the death paintings had, that Yuji now has access to. The Curse Wound death paintings are actually a reference to the 9-face diagram, which is a Buddhist series of 9 paintings that depict the stages of death and decomposition of a corpse. The first few paintings in the series depict the body secreting these bodily fluids, including blood and toxins, as it decomposes, which might be the inspiration for the first 3 death paintings we see in the anime, Choso, Iso, and Kechizu. Their abilities revolve around blood and poisons, so that makes sense. The next few stages depict the body fully decomposing and then becoming scattered bones. If Gege continues paying homage to the 9-face diagram, I wouldn't be surprised if Yuji has some kind of like zombie abilities or some bone related shenanigans like Kimimaru from Naruto. I don't know, that's just a silly guess, but it would be cool. Well, even with all the cursed energy buffs and techniques from the death paintings, the cursed energy from being Sukuna's vessel, and Sukuna's own curse technique, I still find it hard to believe that Yuji can defeat this reincarnated Sukuna. That's probably why he's gonna pull out the cheese play by doing some soul swapping shenanigans. This is where the second thing I told you to pin comes into play. I know it's been a while, so you probably don't remember, but yeah, remove that second pin. Well, what I'm referring to is of course the book that Choso gave to Yuji, covering Yuki's research on the soul. After receiving this book, we see in chapter 222 that Yuji might have learned a thing or two from it, as it seems that he managed to swap bodies with Kusakabe somehow, meaning that Yuji has learned some kind of soul swapping ability from the book, something that likely came easy to him considering he's essentially a twin of someone that learned how to consume souls in the Heian era. Sukuna, of course. Messing around with souls is in their blood. Yuji probably plans to somehow pull Sukuna's soul into his own body again, in order to contain him since he can't defeat him on his own, but that likely isn't possible until Sukuna is further weakened. That's likely the plan right now, as it was pointed out in chapter 220 that Yuji apparently had a plan to help Megumi, and Maki said that regardless of a plan, they'd need to render Sukuna immobile before trying anything. So this means that Yuji's gonna hop in, flex his new super strong abilities, massive cursed energy reserves, and even use Sukuna's own curse technique against him. It's still probably not gonna be enough to beat him, but Sukuna will likely be weakened enough for Yuji to pull his soul into his body, and from that point, only Gege knows what happens from there. But if we learned anything from how he likes to do our favorite characters in the series, it's probably not going to be a happy ending.